and welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their career-defining drug, song and book, and also share their joyful patient stories.
Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. For this episode, we're joined by Professor Lauren Walker from the University of Liverpool. Lauren is a Professor of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics and an Honorary Consultant in General Internal Medicine. We'll hear from Lauren in a moment as she shares a drug for our formulary, her career anthem, and recommends a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. Our micro discussion this week looks at clinical trials, in particular the underrepresentation of certain subgroups, informed by current status of inclusion of older groups in evaluations of new medications, gaps and implementation needs to fill them. Snappy title from the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both.
Welcome, good evening. So we haven't seen each other for a while. I think it's the first time we've recorded since Christmas. So even though this is probably February when people listen to it, Happy New Year. But yeah, it's been a busy month in the NHS. I'm sure you're feeling it, Steve. But certainly in acute care, it's critical at the moment. So yeah, so big shout out to any healthcare staff out there, because I know everyone is under the cosh at the moment.
That's very true. I mean, we've said it before, but I'll say it again. We have an NHS situation going on, don't we? And it's particularly bad at the minute. And actually, I was thinking about that because I've had 3 recent uses of healthcare, and also somebody who's a friend of my daughter's who's studying nursing came for Sunday lunch, and she said, "Oh, Steve, can you help me? I've got to write a 3,000-word essay on should the NHS continue to be free." I said, "Oh, lovely, great." And she looked at me and she was so scared. And so we got into some chat. But I was thinking, well, is the NHS free anyway for everybody, for everything? And so, I've been to the osteopath this week. I went to Specsavers to have my eyes checked and a new pair of glasses. And I went to the dentist and I paid a fee for my NHS dental fee. So, but what I would say about all of those things was, I know we talk a lot about shared decision making, but I had some great consultations. The dentist was phenomenal. And when I said to him, "Do you want me to give you, due respect on the podcast?" He said no. So, but I must say that he was great, because without any prompting, and he did know I was a pharmacist, but without any prompting, we got into these are the options, do nothing, alternatives, risks and benefits. And I said to him, "This is so great." I said, "I'm loving this." And it was similar when I went to get my eyes tested and sort out that, and the osteopath as well. So it was really just a big shout out to people who work in the NHS, and remember that it's not always free for everybody at the point of care. And I'm not sure it ever will remain that way, because I can't see a way out of the current situation that we're in.
Not all you've been doing, is it, Steve? Anything else you want to tell us about?
Oh, no.
Oh, I spent all day on a training course to be in the High Court in a few weeks' time. That was interesting, getting cross-examined.
He's teasing you, listener. He's teasing you.
Oh, I see. You're on about that paper that I wrote. I was asked to write a provocative piece about pharmacists prescribing in general practice.
I think you've had your Charlotte Church voice of an angel moment. So a very strong media appearance on not quite Richard and Judy, but...
Do you want to describe it? Go on, describe it, because I know you guys are going to take the mic, and so you should.
No, not at all.
No,
not at all. It was a good piece. What was it? What was it called? Which
Morning
one?
Live. BBC One Morning Live with Professor Green, no less. I'll tell you, all the girls in the practice everyone was like, "Will he do selfies? Will he do selfies?" And so loads of them came up for selfies, and I didn't actually realise who he was. But yeah, no, I think we're happy with the piece. It was all about trying to get the message across about, Professor Green summed it up beautifully at the end when he said, looked straight at the camera at the millions of people sat on their sofa watching at 10 o'clock in the morning, and he said, "Make sure that polypharmacy works for you." Which I thought was brilliant, because we weren't trying to say that lots of medicines is bad. We were trying to say that lots of medicines, when it doesn't mix well, problematic polypharmacy is something that we can do something about. So I felt that they really got it right, actually. And the editor, Jake, was excellent. So yeah, we'll put it in the show notes, obviously. And yeah, got to get it out there, haven't you? And talking about the expertise of clinical pharmacists working in general practice. So yeah, it was all good.
Yeah, it was a great piece. You came across really well, and I'm serious. I think that should be the start of your your media presence now. I think somebody should. I, for one, would love to see you on the airways talking about clinical pharmacy and therapeutics. But
Well, thank you. Shall I give you my Alan Partridge moment that didn't get into the edit?
Go on.
So we filmed all day for 7 minutes. So it's quite hard to, you know, try to give the messages and try to keep it, even though they're asked for different styles, or not styles, different angles on the same question. But at one point, Professor Green said to me something like, wow, it must take a lot of preparation and a lot of brain power for you to think about all those conditions and all those medicines. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, I guess at the end of the day, you've got to know your onions.
very good. Okay. Quick one for me. Look, it's the UK Medicines Information 50th year anniversary conference today and tomorrow.
Is it?
So yeah, 50 years UKMI has been going. And so I went this morning. I'm speaking for them tomorrow morning. So I went this morning just to listen to some background, and I listened to some legends from the world of medicines information, now medicines advice. Peter Golightly,
Yeah.
David Erskine, Fiona
Yes.
Woods. And so as they reflected on their stories of the last 40 to 50 years, David pointed out that they've been continuously told that they won't be needed in 2 years' time. and 50 years later, honestly, I listened to them and I just, the word bedrock came to mind. They have been an absolute bedrock of evidence-based medicine, evidence-based principles, clinical pharmacy. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow, but it was a real pleasure to listen to some of their reflections.
Happy to say I know all those people you mentioned, and I was trained in the ways of medicines information. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, as was I, and I'll be sharing that with them tomorrow. And once you're trained, it stays with you for life. Okay, let's move on. Our guest has been very patient, even with a little titter as she comes in. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Lauren Walker. A clinical pharmacologist, she's also the Deputy Director of the NIHR Clinical Research Facility at Liverpool University Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust and Co-Director of the Centre for Experimental Therapeutics at the University of Liverpool. Welcome to the podcast, Lauren. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Lawrence, in Partridge style, what is a clinical pharmacologist?
I always wish I had a pound for every time I get asked that question, because we're a tiny medical specialty, really, and it's quite a broad church. So we're general physicians. So I'm a medical consultant, and we either do kind of general medical inpatient ward work. It's secondary care. So most of us work in hospitals, or we do acute medicine. So that's the kind of NHS component of our role. And we don't have an organ. Our specialty is medicines, not unlike obviously a clinical pharmacist, but there tends to be the roles that we do within the NHS are all around kind of medicines governance, looking at which medicines should or shouldn't go on to the formulary and making risk and benefit decisions about medicines. And then the other hats that some of us wear, so I'm a first-in-human principal investigator, so many of us do early-phase clinical trials and test drugs in humans, and indeed in sort of first-into-patient studies, the kind of higher-risk end of the drug discovery and development pipeline. And then increasingly now, which is my kind of area of interest, is medicines optimization and supporting the delivery of medicines optimization services through secondary care in reach into primary care, because obviously the biggest kind of burden of prescribing is done in primary care, but we're us hospital consultants are the culprits of some of the riskier and higher cost stuff. So it's sort of our duty as clinical pharmacologists to support that medicines optimization from the secondary care end.
Was there something that triggered an interest, or just something that evolved through med school, or?
Yeah, but yeah, so there are, I think I had more exposure to clinical pharmacology because I trained in Liverpool, and there's a lot of us. It's the biggest training centre. So I guess I met some. There's many people who've never met a clinical pharmacologist if you don't work in kind of Liverpool or London. And so I was exposed to it during medical school, but it was actually my first kind of house job when I first qualified, and I just really liked the variety. It's a lot of the inpatient work is complex patients that have lots of different conditions, and therefore they don't fit into a nice specialty ward or a nice specialty box. And I liked that I never and then all through my training, I never really found an organ that I was particularly attached to. Although I did train as a neuro, I triple accredited for a while, so I did train as a neurologist as well, and did a lot of epilepsy. My PhD is in epilepsy and kind of neuroscience, but it didn't stick. I'm too much of a generalist.
Well, you're lucky you didn't go on to become a single organologist,
Oh.
Lauren. Otherwise, Steve would have had no time for you whatsoever.
STC would have been, I'd have been lovely, but I'd have been firm.
So the clinical pharmacologist pass your test, Steve? Are you okay with them?
Oh, definitely. And I was actually, we were joking earlier about medicines information, but I first trained, my first year was at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London in 1991. And there was a legendary professor in clinical pharmacology there whose name is currently escaping me. But I would say that my 33 years as a clinician and thinking in a holistic way and understanding pathophysiology and medicines was really because of that guy, because we used to go up to the library in Bart's Hospital, and if this week we were doing livers, he'd get like 6 different livers down from that were all in big, vats of formalin. And he'd talk us through that cirrhosis. This is that. You go, right, off we go. And then we go down to the ward and we go and find the liver patients. And so I was massively taken on board by that. And I think I remained like you in similar but different. And I've always remembered that. And so, I've big up to clinical pharmacologists. And we were joking before, you're far too young, Lauren, but there used to be quite a lot of beef in the past, I think in the 80s, even before we started, about, between clinical pharmacologists, when clinical pharmacy first started. But I've always said to them, like, look, guys, you're the SAS, right? But you need a whole regiment of other, army people on the ground. And that can be us. And you guys are the SAS. That's the way I've always described it.
It's definitely a winning combination, isn't it? I think a pharmacist and a clinical pharmacologist is a winning combination. And I would encourage any of the pharmacists listening to this podcast, if they haven't buddied up and found their clinical pharmacologist of choice, then do so.
You're right, though. There's a very small number, isn't it? I mean, you could probably tell us what the number is, but
I think there's about 70, something like that in the UK. It's not compared to,
Yeah, of course. So crack troops. That's what I'm talking about.
Well, and the clinical pharmacologists who are in the offices next to me, who I work with, they talk about hatching dinosaur eggs. That when you get one of the the trainees coming through, you have to really look after them to make sure that they don't get distracted by single organologists.
By organs.
Yeah.
Don't look at any organs.
So, Lauren, you, as you mentioned, you are unique. Well, not unique, but you sound, from when I heard you speak, and the reason we asked you to come on as a guest is the 4th apothecary, Claire Howard, had you on to do a excellent 1-hour webinar about people being different as they get older in relation to how they handle drugs. But I was really struck by that, like you mentioned earlier, about this stuff that you do, like early phase clinical trials, you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you talked about some fascinating stuff, really, in relation to that. Could you just, because our listenership is mainly health professionals, but we do have some non-health professionals as well. Could you describe just, how different that is between, the end of prescribing in an 86-year-old person versus, and I know we'll talk a little bit more detail in the micro discussion, but I'm really fascinated in that phase 1 stuff that you talked about, because I think people will always, if you can remember, the Elephant Man trial that happened at Norfolk Park, didn't it? And so people always remember that, don't they? It was TGN 1412. Can you put some context to that and how it's different now?
Yeah. So I always feel I have to point out, it was at the Parexel unit at Norfolk Park. So Norfolk Park were the heroes. They saved the people. But yeah, it does go to show you, doesn't it? Reputation is everything. And that was what was on the news. But I always feel a bit bad for Norfolk Park.
I'm glad you've righted a wrong there.
Yeah, because it was their ITU that took the participants in. So I'm a first-in-human investigator, so that means I can, accredited by our regulator, by the MHRA, to test drugs in humans for the first time. And part of my role is around looking at the animal data for new medicines. So as a new medicine is developed, how it's been tested in laboratory models and in preclinical models, and then trying to convert that to what they call a human equivalent dose. So looking at how can we safely test that, what's going to be the clinical development plan. And most medicines For phase 1, it's 1A and 1B. So most medicines are tested in healthy volunteers first. And because you have no pre-existing human experience at all, there's lots of safety that's built into that first in human or first in healthy volunteer experience. But because you've got no idea, the unexpected can always happen. That means that you have that protocol, the way that you're going to do that first in human trial is extremely rigid. So you really want to control for every possible eventuality, so that you don't have any kind of variation. So that means people need to. It predisposes you to young, fit, healthy individuals.
White men, I think you said as well, predominantly, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'll sort of explain why we kind of veer towards that end. But you have to have kind of perfect kidney function, perfect livers, perfect cardiovascular system, narrow blood pressure parameters, narrow heart rate ranges, so that you can detect early safety signals, because that's the critical aspect. You want to know, if you're investing hundreds of millions of pounds in a clinical trial program for a new medicine, that if it's going to be a problem, you find that out as early as you can. You don't want to find that out when you're at the efficacy stage later down the line, when you've invested hundreds of millions. So units like the one that I work in Liverpool, they tend to be co-located. They tend to be in city centres. They're co-located alongside universities because they're situated within big city centre teaching hospitals. And so as a result, when you're trying to recruit a very, very fit and healthy population, you tend to recruit from the nearby student population. That's by nature of location. We recruit from freshers' fairs and things like that.
Yeah. I think they put sperm banks in similar places as well, don't they?
Yeah. So that tends to predispose you to younger people, but why they tend to be why we tend to recruit more males than females are around the strict criteria around contraception for early phase trials. So it's much harder for females to take part because you need to, has to be 2 forms of contraception, one of which is highly effective. But it's so it is more challenging for females generally. And the other aspect around why it tends to be the student population is that they're very labour intensive phase 1 trials. So I'm running one at the moment. It's a 5-night inpatient stay. Some of them involve a 14-night inpatient stay because of those the kind of safety observations around when you first give that drug and what its half-life is and how long it's going to linger for.
And just to be clear, do they get paid? I would think. Yeah, this is not volunteering for the good of man and woman.
We call them healthy volunteers, and obviously it's an incredibly altruistic thing to do.
Yes.
But you are compensated,
remunerated,
for your time. But it's not a thing that's easy for the average middle-aged working adult to do, because it's not just the inpatient stay, it's the subsequent visits. So when they're collecting the PK samples over time, it's really difficult. So that then just tends to veer you towards young, fit, healthy men. And then that's why we don't then I don't treat very many young, fit, healthy men in my clinical practice. When I do a ward round in acute medicine, when I do an outpatient clinic, that the people in whom I've developed the dose, because that's what phase 1 is. It's about making sure that the dose that you've got is safe and that you can achieve a blood concentration that is high enough that it's likely to be effective. But phase 1 is all about the safety aspect. So when it's then deployed later, once it gets a license and you've had much more human experience, the people that use that medicine look vastly different to the people in whom the dose
so that
was
early
determined.
Stage is more about safety as opposed to clinical. You're not looking for the clinical stuff then.
No, I mean, obviously all companies, they want an efficacy signal as early as possible, and we do find that there's a lot of time spent saying to people, you probably can't draw that conclusion from 12 people.
Yeah. And a low dose. I can remember, do you boys remember the Cough and Cold Research Centre in Cardiff Uni? That used to be a source of income for many in my year.
Jamie, we all went along, didn't we, as a collective?
We used to pretend to have colds and then pretend to fill in a diary and all sorts of stuff.
I don't think I was on that trip.
No, you were. We did a collective where it wasn't to do with coughs and colds. It was to do with antihistamines. Remember?
Yeah, I wasn't there for that one.
Oh, and we were like, because we were first year pharmacy students, the civil engineers and the town planners in our group were like, will this be okay? We were like, it's okay, boys. These are already licensed medicines, and they were. So it wasn't what you're talking about, but we were still getting paid.
But they've been withdrawn from the market subsequently.
No,
I was
They're
gonna say, I think
pro-arrhythmic.
I was doing nasal sprays.
So we had the skin allergy test to see if we had a histamine response. And then, of course, me and one of the other guys did, which meant that they wanted us, which meant that we had to stay in. And therefore, we weren't supposed to drink alcohol. And that's where the issue about whether or not you did or you didn't take part. I couldn't possibly comment on my colleague as to what he did or didn't do.
So, Lauren, you mentioned the pharmaceutical industry. These are collaborations, aren't they? They're commissioning the university to conduct these.
Yeah, broadly speaking, for most clinical research facilities, there's a combination of work. So it'll either be that the pharmaceutical company is the sponsor, and that might be, big pharma, and they will sponsor the trial, and that's the protocol comes to us then all ready to go. So they've already decided on the population and the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and my job is to deliver it. And then kind of alongside that, there's your smaller biotechs with whom we would work collaboratively to develop the clinical development plan, because they're smaller, they have less money, they may have fewer candidate drugs. So we tend to get involved at an earlier stage and try to advise them and guide them on, a realistic population. That's the bit that I like. I like working with companies where we can say, you're going to struggle to recruit there, or this population doesn't, it's a bit niche, it's not really going to represent the actual patients that you want to, ultimately get a license for your medicine in. And then we also have kind of investigator-led studies. So that's the academic institution itself, where they might be working with a company to develop a compound where a lot of the preclinical development has been done within the university.
Still early days in your career, it feels like, it on one sense. So have you got any medicines that, because sometimes people retire, don't they, and they look back on their career and they're involved in, some of the big blockbuster meds. What's your experience to date, Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I have to be careful because I do phase 1 and it's about 10 years to the development of a drug. So there are some very exciting medicines that I've worked on that I probably couldn't tell you too much about. But I think the advanced therapeutics, the emergence of gene therapies for orphan diseases or really rare diseases, is a really interesting and exciting area to work on or to be involved in. I think I'll be very proud in the future, in the years to come, to know that I delivered some of those for conditions in which there is no known treatment. So some of that stuff is pretty exciting. And then I guess for me, some of the stuff we're kind of proudest of was around the work that we did during the pandemic on phase 1 kind of dose determining studies. So doing first in patients, so first in COVID was a really kind of exciting and terrifying time, because these were particularly at the start of the pandemic, because it's hard enough convincing people to take an experimental drug. It's very hard to convince them to do it when we can't even reassure them of how the course of their virus is going to go. And sometimes we forget that now in the kind of post-vaccine era, that right at the start, people were terrified. They had no idea what was going to happen to them. And then they'd have someone like me on the phone saying, "Oh, I see you've tested positive for COVID. Would you like to come into our unit for a few days and test a drug that's never been tested in humans before?" So there were some incredibly brave people that did that.
There are always opportunities.
You just mentioned it, actually, but for the listener, how long to take something from phase 1 healthy volunteers through to the marketplace? Well,
so it varies. It's a difficult one. It depends what it is that if your disease is very common, so if you're developing something and the population is very broad, then your recruitment criteria, your inclusion and exclusion, can be quite broad, and therefore your recruitment speed will be quite fast. And
like
so you
blood
can
pressure medicine or something.
Yeah, exactly. Things like that, heart failure medicines, things like that, where you can recruit at high volume. But that kind of era of blockbuster drug development is sort of behind us, really. I know that there, with exceptions, but generally that work has been done. And now, actually, more of the focus is on orphan diseases or subtypes of particular diseases or gene-directed therapies and things. So those ones are harder to recruit for. They take longer, so the development pipeline might be longer. But it is probably 5 to 7 years, something like that. We used to say it was the total cost of discovery to licensing was $1 billion. It's probably closer to $2 billion now.
Very distressing. I have to update my lecture now, Lauren, from 15 years ago.
So if you're an avid Oral Apothecary listener, or indeed you're new to the podcast and you want to go back into the archives, there was a brilliant episode, 4.10, with somebody called Professor Claire Thompson. And she worked for one of these startups, her job, she's a pharmaceutical scientist, and it was called Badly Behaved Molecules. And she basically looked after a company that was trying to bring things, essentially, I would suggest, to the point where you would then do the first tests. That's what she did. And she was a ray of sunshine, I think, when we did that episode. She's an incredibly positive lady. She was into football. Do you remember, boys? So that was a really good link episode, actually. And yeah, so it's a fascinating world. And I think that's why I really wanted to talk about it with you tonight, because we will always get sucked into older multimorbidity, shared decision making, and so we should, because if you like, some of those features are true of whether or not you are old or older or not. But actually, we forget, don't we, that, and for the listeners in particular, we wanted to go down a different angle that we'd never really taken before. And yours is fascinating because you're actually doing like you've just described, right through to that 85-year-old person who's got 20 conditions and 24 medicines.
And that's I think why it does. I think how I ended up kind of doing my research into medicines optimization, and why I'm very interested in discontinuing medicines at when I feel that their risk profile outweighs their potential for benefit, is because I've spent a decade consenting really young, like the absolute peak of humanity into a dose determining trial, and then I'm giving a medicine to a very frail, multimorbid, at the extremes of age individual, and thinking, surely there's a dose problem. There's likely to be a dose problem here, because these two people are just not comparable.
Yeah. You're also very much part, aren't you, of Munir Pir Mohammed, who's the chair, isn't he, there in Liverpool? And he's a legend himself, isn't he? I've met him a few times. Because I think I'm guessing through him as well, but I think you might be leading your own research now, are doing stuff around people who get admitted to hospitals due to medicines, aren't you? You were part of that very big study group that he led, weren't you? Which is a fascinating. We quote that all the time, and why wouldn't we? 16.5% of people admitted with unplanned admissions. And I worked this out before going on the BBC because I wanted to get big numbers in. But I looked at the latest statistics, and in England, if you took that 16.5%, that is 1 million admissions last year. And 40% of them are potentially avoidable. So again, you're right at the cutting edge of from beginning right through, aren't you? But do you like that part of it? And how much further do you think we've got to go on the research to be able to, let's be honest, to bring the doubters with us?
And I suppose the short answer is I still think it's a very long way to go. So that update, so obviously Munir did the original study 20 odd years ago, and it was 6.5%. We talked about it on and off for years, saying we really.
Dr. Chris Green was involved in that. He's a pharmacist. I know Chris. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we talked about was the need to update it, but also that very point that I was saying. Most of the original data collection was done. It was done by pharmacists in in a less multimorbid population than what we've got now. So I said, so myself and one of our registrars, Rostam at that time, who was the first author for the paper, said we would collect the data. And it's one of those things that you sort of suggest and then think, what on earth was I thinking? So we had to review all the admissions, and it was admissions lasting more than 24 hours. But it was incredibly time consuming, but also really informative in the sense that you you can be completely confident that this is the medicines that they're on. That may not be the only reason that they're here, but it is certainly complicating the admission without question. And that was much worse in older, frailer people and much worse in multimorbid people. And that's the bit that that makes me feel so strongly about the risk to benefit relationship. And I do a post-take ward round in acute medicine every week, and I always have conversations. And I was speaking to one of my consultant colleagues about this only this week. He had, I think I'm rubbing off on him, he had a conversation with an 85-year-old and her daughter on exactly that point, that I could start medicines X, Y, and Z today, but what are your priorities? What do you want to achieve with the rest of your life? The chances are that you're very likely to end up in hospital because of some of these medicines. If I add this to the cocktail that you're already taking. So what would you like me to do? They had a long chat about it. I have these kinds of discussions, and quite often people say, well, to be honest, I don't take the ones that I've got. I'd rather not have any more.
Yeah.
One of our big challenges from a secondary care perspective is, if we invest that amount of time and have that discussion, is that there's no real way. I always wish there was some sort of electronic stamp that you could put in somebody's notes that says this person has had a comprehensive medicine review, and we have decided not to begin preventative therapies. And that's why they're not on a statin, and that's why they're not taking an ACE inhibitor for their heart failure. That is a shared decision, and it's been made. And I think in the future we're going to need something like that, because the problem is that otherwise it's a total waste of time. If it's not recorded, then somebody just comes along.
Absolutely. We talk about that all the time. And of course you would agree with me, I know you would, and that's all right if something then changes in a year's time, and then for whatever reason you change your mind, and that's fine too. But you're right, it needs to be a stamp that people can see, and respect, I think, is the key word. So we have a lot of patients on here, right? And
trust, I think, is the word.
Yeah, exactly. And trust. So likewise today I had exactly the same conversation about whether a chap wanted to start anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation. And when I said to him, I'm always very careful, and I say, so tell me what in this case it was a cardiologist, tell me what the cardiologist told you. He said, I just got a message that told me I've got an irregular heartbeat, I need to start blood thinners. I said, okay then. So anyway, we got into a long discussion, and he decided he didn't want to take it. So that's fine. Listen, the boys are going to groan now, but I sometimes like analogies. Well, I love analogies. So I want to test this one out on you. This has never been talked about before. So tell me exactly what you think. So in this world, you've called it, I think you used risk-benefit profile. Yeah. So my latest analogy is this. We all know about a coin.
Is there an animal involved?
No, there's not an animal. I thought I wouldn't give her the one about the other thing is that when you're in hospital, you're not in your natural habitat. Okay. And so that's also another one, but it's not that one, Gimmo. It's this one. So we all know a coin. We all know there's a head and a tail, don't we? But do you know about the medication coin? And the medication coin has got triumphs and it's got harms. Do you like that?
Yeah, I do.
You should have checked that with us first, Steve.
I don't like to check this stuff. I like to give it live.
You've put our guest on the spot. You've put our guest on the spot.
So that's my current one. I use it now. Medication coin.
They come along all the time, Lauren. Can't stop him. They're just.
Yeah. I quite like it though, because what is triumph?
Don't humour him.
Come on, Lauren, speak up for me. I get a lot of grief on this program. Go on, tell me.
When it comes to medicines, what is triumph or what is success? What does that? It's different for everybody, isn't it? Everybody feels differently about what a good outcome is from their medicines. So I quite like it. I like that analogy.
Thank you. And I will give a part to he's departed now as my senior pharmacy technician, but Darren Jones, because we were in the office and he knows what I'm like. And I said, I need a T, right? We've got the H for harms. That's easy, but we need a T. And he's straight on to ChatGPT, giving me a load of them. I said, no, don't want that one. Don't want that one. Don't want that one. Triumph, he said. I said, oh, that's brilliant. We'll have that. So yes, there you go. Fellow listeners, medication coin. It has triumph and it has harm.
It's a hard no from me.
So as if I haven't said enough tonight already, can you tell I was very excited about having Lauren on?
The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
Right, shall we move on? So, Lauren, we will come back to talk about in a bit more detail about what happens, and why there's a problem around older people and multimorbid in clinical trials. But for now, you are very much in the spotlight. And so you know that you are, as a guest on the Oral Apothecary, are allowed to give us 3 things. We go in a strict order. And the first one is your desert island drug, which is to evoke a powerful memory, not to save you or anyone else on a desert island. So what would you like to give us and why?
So my desert island medicine is clobazam. It's the
Clobazam, yeah.
Yeah, it's the adjuvant anti-seizure medicine, clobazam.
And why is that?
Ah, I was hoping you would ask me that. So because it has very interesting pharmacology. So
I like this. I'm liking this already.
this is why it excites me. So all benzodiazepines have the same sort of 5 properties. They sedate you, they're anti-seizure, anti kind of anxiolytics. So they have the 5, but they are sedatives. And the difference between clobazam and the other benzodiazepines is that so they all have a benzene ring, and all the other benzodiazepines have.
Gimmo loves benzene rings.
Yeah, have nitrogen at position 4, whereas clobazam, it's moved over, so it's at position 5 on the benzene ring, which means that the way that so they all bind GABA A receptors, but the way, because they're allosteric modulators, so the way that clobazam binds is not as, basically it's not as good at creating sedation as the other benzodiazepines, which is a positive if you want to give it for a seizure disorder, because it means you're going to have to take it every day. So although it has all the other 4 properties and importantly the anti-seizure property of the benzodiazepines, it does not sedate you to the same extent as, for example, if you took regular diazepam every day, just by moving that one position on the benzene ring. I think it's super cool pharmacology.
That is cool.
I'm seeing the diagram in my head now.
Yeah.
Of it not binding to that receptor.
Exactly.
Can I ask a controversial comeback on that then?
Oh, come on. Yeah, come on.
Is that true? Because it sounds biologically plausible and pharmacologically plausible, and the 3 of us have bought into it. You've reminded us of something that we once knew.
Oh, he's cheeky, isn't he?
Does it then translate actually into that clinical?
Yeah. So because from my experience, I used to do epilepsy clinics when I was doing my PhD, and
go on, you tell him.
It is the only benzo that people can tolerate taking regularly without that degree of sedation. Now, it's not to suggest that it doesn't sedate you at all, but it's certainly less sedating. There's lots of people who achieve good seizure control with clobazam as an adjuvant without becoming completely sedated as you would do, I suppose, if you were taking.
Yeah, and I concur wholeheartedly. Seen plenty of people, as you say, who end up on it for when they get into really bad refractory seizures, don't they? And then they end up on a sort of long-term dose for quite a while. So that's a great choice.
I wonder if they shifted it around deliberately or whether that was just a chance discovery then.
Yeah, was it like serendipity?
It's probably quite old, I would have thought, isn't it?
Yeah, and I have tried to find that out because I'm nerdy like that, and I really wanted to know, was that serendipity, or did they actually think that through about how that would affect? But I've never been able to find it out.
Buzz in for a bonus mark, the 3 of you. What is the well-known trade name of clobazam? Begins with an F. Frisium.
Frisium. Oh God.
You're too young. Lauren.
Yeah, I don't know that.
I can see the pot.
But little blue in a little.
It's a little blue pot, wasn't it?
Yeah.
With red writing. Have I got that right on the pot?
There you go.
You've slipped into farmer porn now again, so move on.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Lauren. Great. The second thing is a career anthem for the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist. And yes, sing along. It really is on Spotify. So what would you like to offer us?
So it was difficult, this one, but I chose the song called Rise Up, which is sung by Andra Day.
Right.
Yeah. Because it's all about, I suppose, about kind of rising up against adversity and trying to, kind of, sometimes you feel like you're pushing a boulder up a mountain, don't you? Or trying to keep going, or trying to kind of push on in the face of challenges and things like that, which I think is, you learn to have a very thick skin as a clinical academic, and trying to get money in to be able to explore the things that you find exciting and interesting, and you get really passionate. You have these big passion projects that you're really committed to doing, and you put many hours in, and then it goes to a funding committee and they say no, sorry. And I accept that, because there's only so much money to go around, but it's painful at the time when you think about how hard you've worked. So
you might not know this, but the last guest was also an academic, and she picked a different song, but for the same reason. And she called it, wait for this, she called it The Second Reviewer, who absolutely killed it. And so you will get that 100%.
Yeah.
So I'm not familiar with that song. There's not many songs that have been picked that I'm not familiar with. So what sort of artist is Andra Day? Yeah.
Andra Day. So I don't believe it's written by her, but it is sung by her. And I must confess, it's the only one. It's the sort of, it was one of those things where
she's a one-hit wonder.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I heard it on Six Music, I think, and then.
I like it you more every minute. Six Music listener, yeah.
So sort of Shazam it, and then we have a Six Music playlist, which are all things we've heard on Six, but we'd not heard them before. So it was one of those. So I don't know actually. I can't confess that I am
okay.
Have other
Excellent.
songs.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm a massive Chris Hawkins fan. So anyway, so that's great. So we'll put that on. As I say, it's an excellent playlist. So Rise Up by Andra Day, brilliant. And the third thing is a book recommendation for the Oral Apothecary Library.
Yeah, so I struggled with this one. I went back and forth around, because I struggled in the balance between should I go for something that I think is essential, kind of CPD, your clinical professional development.
You can share your options with us. Share your decision making.
So I wanted to go for, because I think
tell us what we want.
Yeah, I think everybody who ever picks up a pen, or in the case of nowadays types into a computer, everybody that prescribes should read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, because of the horrendous nature of the opioid pandemic and crisis and things. So I think anybody, if you're ever going to prescribe any kind of medicine at all, everybody should have read that. I think it is essential.
Yeah, Professor Tony Avery, just for the listener, had previously picked it. But yeah, it's a great book. I read it on his recommendation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, exactly right. So I saw Tony had suggested that one. So then I thought, well, I'm just going to go with what is my favourite book, actually, which doesn't sound nearly as cool, because I love sort of kind of anything to do with magic and dragons and fantasy fiction. So I would go with the Farseer trilogy. So that if I had to pick one book, it would be Assassin's Apprentice, which is the first in the Farseer
Robin
trilogy. Robin Hobb, yeah. So I've read everything that Robin Hobb has ever written, but yeah, the Fitz and the kind of fool relationship, which is in the Farseer trilogy, and the very famous, one of the most famous characters is a wolf called Night Eyes, and I have a Maine Coon that's called Night Eyes, which because I love that book so much. So.
Gimo, you're into that kind of stuff, aren't you?
Yeah. So that's on my. I've got actually the first one of his other trilogies. No, it is that one. But I haven't read it. I've got so many to read through at the moment.
There's loads of them.
I'm reading Raymond E. Feist at the moment, which is the magician stuff. There we go. So you'll have read that.
Oh,
so there
yes.
we go.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, that's what we always say about the three choices. There's that music, puts people together, doesn't it? Books can put you in similar tribes, and for us, I guess, desert island drugs as well. But thank you, really great choices.
You're welcome.
Our micro discussion next, looking at the current status of inclusion of older groups in evaluations of new medications, gaps and implementation needs to fill them, by Janice Schwartz from the Division of Geriatrics and Clinical Pharmacology, the University of California. What did you make of it, Lawrence? Obviously on message for you.
It is, yes. And so Janice and I have written a similar, with another, the kind of International Union for Clinical Pharmacology, so a similar sort of position paper about recommendations for things that need to change to be able to include more older adults in clinical trials. So yes, I'm very familiar with that paper, and I agree wholeheartedly with all of the suggestions that are in it for the reasons that we talked about before. Not just the sort of phase 1 aspect, which is your dose determining. I think it's really important that we consider at least doing what I would call kind of geriatric investigation plans, so akin to the pediatric investigation plan, where when you develop a new medicine, you have to have a plan for how you're going to do safe dose determination in children. I personally very strongly believe that we should do the same thing for people over the age of 80 or 85, a small kind of dose confirmatory study, maybe in a unit like mine, 8 individuals with renal impairment, maybe some, an aging liver, that kind of thing, so that we can just check, does that exposure curve, does that dose response relationship look the same in somebody that's 85 versus the 20-year-olds that it was developed in.
So the issue then, Lauren, just to go back, is that older people don't make it into the clinical trials, and then are on the receiving end of decisions where they get prescribed medicines that in effect haven't been tested on them, haven't been tested with their comorbidities.
Yeah, it's a constellation of things. So generally, older people, or that it never sounds very nice to say the oldest old, but by which I mean you're sort of 85 plus, are not well represented in any phase of clinical trials, be that dose determination or efficacy determination. People with multiple long-term health conditions are also not well represented. And people with frailty are not well represented, because as Janice kind of points out in that paper, that it's hard to define frailty, and it's done so in different ways. So if we don't try to define it within clinical trials, then you can't really make any statements about it or compare it across different trials, because at the moment we don't really capture it as an outcome, and it's important to do so. So yeah, I think the challenge is I can understand how it's happened as a trialist. You can see why. If you might be wondering, well, if you're doing a study for a new drug for heart failure, and we know that a lot of people with heart failure are at an advanced age, then surely everybody in that trial is going to be at an advanced age, but they're not. And even the very, much older people that are in those trials, they are the healthiest end of that age spectrum, and they've got to be, because it goes back to thinking of, well, what is the purpose of a randomized controlled trial? The purpose of that RCT is to tell you, can this drug work? Can this blood pressure medicine lower your systolic blood pressure? It's not designed to tell you, will it work in the patient in front of me? And so to answer the question, can it work, you have to keep everything else equal, and you have to remove every other bias. And that means that the population that you try to answer that question in have to look really similar to each other. And that's the challenge. It's the way the study is designed that pushes complex people out.
That was my take when I read it. I think we'd all agree with the principle, but also we know the whole point of clinical trials is you remove as many variables as possible, so you can have some confidence that the intervention that you're making is the one that's causing the effect. And it talks about polypharmacy in there, but I just don't see how that you could ever get reliable results based on polypharmacy. So it's a difficult area, I think. This is what the paper said, isn't it? It's going to be difficult. It's a well-meaning aim, but we have to be realistic about the outcomes that are going to come from this. At the end of the day, we're probably only going to get that information from once it's out in the wild, sort of thing.
So talking about being out in the wild. So it doesn't really mention this, does it? But it's the place for real world trials, isn't it? It doesn't really talk about that. And I know that's because perhaps it was on about clinical trials, but we could argue that they are similar. But that's Gimmo's point, isn't it? Is that we need like data registries, for example. So Scandinavia are very good at, it seems, at keeping data registry. So my interest is anticoagulation, okay, and I'll bang on about it all day. And so, but the point is that we're lacking. And so this chap this afternoon, when we were talking about anticoagulation and the choice, I gave him the medication coin analogy, which he liked. And then I said to him, and the uncertainty in flipping a coin, I said, if I tell you that, and I showed him the GP evidence with the smiley faces of, what your risks and benefits are and how much improvement if you took the drug and how many people would be reduced risk of having a stroke and the risk of bleeding. And I said, but think about the uncertainty of flipping a coin. And I said, and if I tell you that you're on a drug that would have meant that you didn't make it into the clinical trial because that would increase your risk of bleeding, how does that make you feel now? I didn't say it quite like that. I put it in a bit more professional. But in essence, and we have this debate a lot on here with people, is saying that, will we ever be able to do, this sort of traditional trial in somebody who's multimorbid because of those issues, or because they've been trying to do this, it seems, in the States for a long time, and they're just not doing it, are they? They're not. Yeah. They're sort of saying do it, but nobody's doing it. Or do we need to move to more real world trials and data registries to get that? I know it doesn't prove and I love your can it work versus will it work. I think that's a really great phrase for people to hang on to.
And I wonder if this is, I know another area you're involved in research in is the artificial intelligence. And I think this is where artificial intelligence could be really useful, because I think we can plow in all the data we know about interactions and effects, and eventually that will be able to predict, I think, far better than trials in relatively small numbers of people would ever be able to do. Is that what you're looking at as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think ultimately the answer to being able to give better advice to people who have traditionally been excluded from clinical trials is going to be a composite of lots of different things. It's not going to be as simple as saying we need to include more multimorbid people in RCTs, because that's not the answer. How do you define that? There are more than 200 long-term conditions, and multimorbidity is defined as a combination of 2 or more long-term conditions. So that's an exponential number of potential combinations of conditions.
That's what I mean.
And are we really saying that somebody with heart disease and renal failure is identical to somebody with epilepsy and schizophrenia because they're both multimorbid? So I don't think that's going to be the answer, to just do our traditional RCTs, but in an older multimorbid population, because it's too heterogeneous. And the same is true for trying to do dose determination or phase 1 just doing it in older multimorbid people. You still have to keep that really refined population, but I think we need to supplement it with other data, and that's where the real world data and the observational longitudinal studies, so what's happening to the drug once it's released into the wild. But the argument in favour of observational studies is that big can overcome bias. But the reality is that we all know as prescribers, the things that govern our prescribing decisions are very nuanced. We reserve certain medicines for certain populations of people or we don't prescribe certain medicines because of our experience and, the things that shape our thought processes, what they call our clinician mind lines, the things that have happened.
Mind lines. We love mind lines on here. We talked
Lauren,
about that.
Do you know what, Lauren? You're playing STC bingo here.
You are. You're pushing my buttons.
Yeah, you've gone, was it that bloody
Six music,
and now mind lines and heuristics.
Oh. I've got to come up to Liverpool soon.
The other reason I like that artificial intelligence research you're doing, Lauren, the DynRx, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah,
is it essentially what you're creating is a Robo Steve, because it's read to me like basically you're creating a AI clinical pharmacist.
The idea for that project and the idea about how could you use real world data better to answer these prescribing questions genuinely came from my clinical experience. Trying to do complex medication reviews in general practice with some of the tip of the iceberg, really complicated patients, and saying I'd come across a particular prescribing quandary, and I think let's use anticoagulants as an example. Somebody that's on both anticoagulants and antiplatelets, very high bleeding risk, but they've got atrial fibrillation and peripheral vascular disease, and when you've got all these different specialists weighing in about what they should have, and a very high risk of stroke, and all these different things.
Could have, not should have.
And everyone has an opinion, but that prescribing quandary must have happened to 1,000 or more prescribers in very similar patients. And that data is there, it's in existence. People have had to face that quandary over and over again. And some of the people will have decided to discontinue just the antiplatelets. Some people would have said, I'm going to stop the anticoagulants. Some people would have said, I'm going to stop both. And in similar, and then if you could follow, what I'm interested in is if you could follow those people forward through the data and find out, well, what actually happened in the real world, and how many of them went on to have a bleeding event, and how many of them went on to have an embolic event, and how many of those that you stopped the anticoagulant, they had an embolic event, but then they were thrombolized, so all these different step changes of outcomes. That's where I think machine learning and AI is really useful, because to try to track hundreds of thousands of people in different prescribing scenarios forward is very difficult traditional statistics, but a machine learning approach to trying to find the patterns and the outcomes is certainly more doable.
Lauren, I'm already thinking that we need to get you back on for an AI special. We've got somebody else lined up that I've sort of come across, and to send to the chaps, we need to do an AI special.
And oral apothecary analysis.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be great. But I just want to, given that we've done lots of shout outs for other people who've been on the Oral Apothecary, I want to bring this round to an excellent piece by Lucy Pollock, Henry Woodford, who are both consultant geriatricians, and Dan McKenzie, who's a cardiologist, who wrote a fabulous piece in the BMJ about heart failure in older people with frailty. And I don't know if you've seen this, Lauren, but it finishes like this about individualized approach and what we've talked about. I'm going to read it out because I think it's really important. And Jonathan Underhill, again, who's the fifth apothecary, he and I were discussing that this is the boilerplate that should go on NICE guidelines. And it reads like this. Clinical guidelines seek to standardize care, but should acknowledge that they are based on data derived from selected populations with poor representation of older people with more than mild frailty. Extrapolating outcome and safety data from younger people with single organ disease to a more vulnerable population is unwise. Complex combinations of frailty and multimorbidity, along with potential polypharmacy and therapeutic burden, require an individualized approach that acknowledges goals and values.
Okay, thanks all. A big thank you to Lauren for joining us on the Oral Apothecary and for sharing her stories, her Desert Island Drug, her career anthem, and her book for the library. Coming up next time, we'll be joined by Dr. Beth Wynne and Dr. Karen Sankey as we dive into the deep end and explore the inverse care law. Dr. Beth Wynne is a GP working at one of the largest and most deprived practices in Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire area, and Oral Apothecary alumni Karen Sankey from Series 2 returns to the pod. Now a GP turned therapeutic coach, mentor and educator and social entrepreneur, passionate about social and health inclusion. Join us next time on the Oral Apothecary. You can contact us via X at Oral Apothecary. We're on LinkedIn. You can email us at oralapothecarypod@gmail.com.
We are also now on Blue Sky.
But we can't remember the link.
Yeah.
So we'll put it in the show notes.
They'll find us. They'll find us.
At Oral Apothecary, yeah.
Not
at
forgetting the
Oral Apothecary.
website, theoralapothecary.com. Gimmo now with the final ingredient.
Okay, so thank you very much, Lauren. That was really good, and particularly enjoyed the pharmacology deep dive and benzene ring. I'll be thinking about benzene rings tonight. But unfortunately, 150 years too late. That's a pharmacology joke there. Okay, so for today's final ingredients, I wanted to keep on today's theme and take you back to the early days of clinical trials when perhaps things weren't as well regulated as they are today, and actually. It's another example of, I think, what you described as a first-in-human trial. So picture this. It's 1968, and a young 23-year-old Scottish pharmacologist, actually Dr. Richard Marshall, volunteers to test a promising new asthma drug called salbutamol. So I'm guessing you've heard of that one. Richard will be the first ever human to take it, but unfortunately, things don't quite go to plan. A pharmacist's weighing error turned Dr. Marshall and his colleagues into guinea pigs on steroids, literally, as instead of 8 milligrams, he was accidentally dosed with 80 milligrams of the untested drug. So cue pounding hearts, plummeting blood pressure, and a panicked phone call to Sir David Jack, who was the mind behind discovery of salbutamol. And so he rushed round in his limo, and thankfully, beta blockers saved the day. So thankfully, no harm was done. But not one to miss the chance for some pharmacological research, Sir David then embarked on a slightly unorthodox experiment. Dr. Marshall described how he then had to collect his urine for the next 3 days in lemonade bottles. because Sir David was never one to miss an opportunity and wanted to see how quickly the body would clear a huge dose like that. So the outcome, salbutamol became a global game changer. It transferred asthma care forever, as we know. So Jack got his knighthood, and Dr. Marshall, the guy who was overdosed, he walked away with a story to tell, £30 in Boots vouchers, and a very close call.
You have been listening to a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough, original music Jamie Brewster, artwork by David Baker and Jacob Howard.
Thanks for listening to the Oral Apothecary podcast. Warning, always enjoy with an alcoholic drink, especially if operating machinery.
This episode of The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by OneLessPill.com, a medicines optimization consultancy.